Right, I hope everyone can see my slides. Thanks, Hilary. So in the second part of the webinar, I'm going to be looking at the immigration rules around EU nationals coming to the UK to work. Just a preliminary point, when I say EU nationals, I mean to include both citizens of the EU, but also that extended category, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway and Switzerland. As you know, you're going to be sent a copy of the slides. There is quite a lot of detail on my slides, so apologies about that. And at the end of the presentation, you'll see the links to the relevant government guidance where you can find a lot more information about the topics that I'm talking about this afternoon. So firstly, I guess the point to mention right at the outset is to remember that the fact that the UK has reached a trade deal with the EU has not altered the most important Brexit people issue, which is of course the end of freedom of movement. So this means that EU nationals and their family members are no longer free from immigration control, and they're now in scope of our UK immigration rules if they wish to come and live and work in the UK. The UK's immigration system came into effect for non-EU workers in December, but from the 1st of January this year, the new rules were extended to apply to EU nationals. As you can see from the slide, and some of this will resonate from Alice's earlier presentation, but the immigration rules which apply to the EU worker will depend on the category in which they're entering the UK. And the examples I've got on the slide, which I'll be covering this afternoon, are the business visitor category, the temporary worker category. I'm going to touch on eligibility under the EU settlement scheme. We're going to look at frontier workers, skilled workers, and intercompany transferees. So I'm going to have a quick look at all of those categories in the webinar. Of course, immigration rules cover many, many other circumstances, but I think those are the categories that you'll probably be most relevant to those of you listening to the call this afternoon. The last but important point on the slide is to be aware that the impact of the new rules will very often mean that you're going to need to be a sponsor license holder to hire employees from outside the UK. The Home Office, I think, had been expecting a flurry of sponsor license applications, but so far that's not actually happened. That might be down to COVID and the impact of travel restrictions, but possibly because employers have not yet got to grips with the new rules. So my key message here is not to delay, really, and considering if and when you anticipate needing to make a sponsor license application. So be proactive about this, and it will put you in a strong position if you need to recruit from overseas. And that will be particularly the case if, as often you might find in HR, there's a particularly urgent need to fill a vacancy. So this next slide, EU business travel into the UK. This is basically the flip side of what Alice has been talking about. These are the UK rules around business visitors. They actually apply equally to non-EU nationals, but obviously we're just focusing really on EU nationals travelling into the UK. The first point to note, to emphasise, similar to Alice's earlier remarks, are that the EU business visitor cannot work in the UK. So they can't come to do paid work for a UK company or become self-employed. The immigration rules do, however, spell out the activities that a business visitor can do. I've put on the slide the most relevant activities. There are lots more, actually. So it really is worth having a good look at the government guidance in this area so that you can really understand how the business rules might apply to the kind of visitors you've been used to having in the past and whether they would be within scope of these rules going forward. Some of them will sound familiar, Alice touched on them, but this is the UK perspective. So a business visitor's permitted activity include attending meetings, conferences, seminars and interviews, giving a one-off or short series of talks and speeches, negotiating, signing contracts and deals, attending trade fairs, but that's just for promotional work only, not selling directly to the public. Conducting market research is permissible. Equally, if the employee of a foreign manufacturer can come to the UK under these rules to install, dismantle, repair, service or advise on equipment, where that manufacturer has got a contract of purchase or supply something with the UK company. So if the EU business visitors' planned activities are within the rules, then they can enter the UK visa-free. That would be up for 6 months per visit. However, bear in mind, obviously, the longer the stay, the more questions are likely to be asked around whether this is a genuine business trip. Equally, the more frequent or frequent repeat entries might well indicate that the visit goes beyond the permitted activity of the visitor. Obviously, the EU national needs to prove essentially that they're a genuine visitor who is coming to the UK to carry out the permitted activity, and importantly, they're going to leave at the end of their visit. So in order to do that, it's useful to bring some supporting documentation with them. There's some examples in the guidance, but essentially certain of common sense applicable here, but kind of thing you might want to include or to suggest that EU visitor brings is a letter from the host company or the company that's inviting the visitor over, setting out the reasons for their visit, information about where they're staying in the UK. Might also be worth having a document or a letter on company letterhead and notepaper from their home country, their home employer, confirming their role and their job description, that kind of thing. Again, there's a certain amount of guidance around this kind of documentary evidence and what might be useful in particular circumstances. If the activities to be carried out by the EU national are not within the business visitor rule, then you're going to have to find another possible immigration route. And the next one to briefly look at is the temporary worker route. This will resonate because it's a little aligned to some of Alice's earlier comments. This is where a EU national on a short business trip or short work trip who don't meet the business visitor rules, they might be able to look at what they call a temporary worker route. Used to be called a tier 5 for those familiar with this, with the old rules. It's a possible post-Brexit option for EU nationals employed by an EU service supplier that has signed a service contract with the UK company for up to 12 months, but, and if it requires a temporary presence of its employees in the UK. This worker route does require the EU national to be sponsored, and the worker can be granted stay up to 12 months to fulfil the service supply contract with a final consumer. So some of that language replicates some of Alice's comments earlier. When thinking about the immigration rules that apply to EU nationals post-Brexit, it's really worth remembering that many EU nationals will be able to take advantage of the EU settlement scheme. So EU citizens who were in the UK by the end of the transitional period, so by the end of 2020, they're protected by the withdrawal agreement with the EU. So they can continue to live and work in the UK as they did before. They've got retained rights and the same rights they had to work, study and access public services. The EU settlement scheme opened in March 2019, so many eligible EU nationals have already applied. I think the Home Office has a running tally, and I think it's now over 4 million applications have been successfully processed. But those eligible EU nationals who've yet to apply can still do so. They have until the end of June 2021 to do this. It's a fairly straightforward, free online application. It's normally granted, turned around quite quickly, often within a week, although there may be some delays at the moment due to COVID. Point to note, for the sake of completeness, really on that slide is that Irish nationals need not apply because, of course, the UK's got a long-standing arrangement with Ireland under the Common Travel Area, which predates the EU. So those Irish nationals don't need to apply under this EU settlement scheme, and they can move freely and live in the UK or Ireland as they choose. Sorry. An EU national who can establish 5 years continuous residence in the UK at the time of their application will be granted settled status, and those with less than 5 years UK residence will be granted what's called a pre-settled status, which itself will last for 5 years. Therefore, it allows the applicant further time in order to put a subsequent application in for settled status. So how does the EU settled status scheme work? Well, it's basically a process that's based on the applicant proving their identity. It involves basically loading a selfie and proving length of residence in the UK and satisfying a criminal records check. Applicants are usually asked to provide the national insurance number, so that enables a kind of automatic data check to be made against their tax and social security records. And if that's confirmed, then the applicant doesn't need to provide any other additional evidence of their residence. The applicant can choose not to provide their tax and national insurance records. They may not be able to demonstrate that. They may not have a complete set of records to cover their period of residency. So in which case they can choose other documentary evidence to support their application. That might be bank statements, utility bills, NHS documentation. Again, the guidance on the Home Office website is really comprehensive on this for any EU national looking to submit an application under the EU settlement scheme. There's lots of information and support there for them. Continuously resident generally means that the applicant has not been absent from the UK for more than 6 months in any 12-month rolling period. There isn't a restriction on the number of absences permitted, provided the total period doesn't exceed 6 months in a 12-month period. There are some exceptions where the one single period of more than 6 months is allowed. Again, the Home Office guidance lists them all out, but it's things like childbirth, serious illness, and sometimes an overseas posting might be relevant in your circumstances. A couple of points I put on the slide there are just relevant to the current COVID pandemic. Proving residence may not be that straightforward for some individuals who have previously been in the UK, but have then spent some substantial time abroad. They may have gone back to their home country to sit out and wait out the pandemic. That might have broken their continuity of residence, which means they might need to start counting again. Equally, it's possible that given the widespread travel bans, some EU nationals who had planned to come to the UK before the end of the transition period, so before the end of December 2020, may not have been able to get here because of the travel bans. So that might have thwarted their plans to access the EU settlement scheme. The Home Office at the moment has so far declined to offer any real concessions in this area, so that may well catch some people out, unfortunately. A successful application under the EU settlement scheme, the applicant just gets sent an email. There isn't a physical document, but there is a unique reference number granted to the individual. So, impact on employers. The first point is a really important point to take away from today, for those of you who haven't already got this subject sorted. It's really important to have good communication with your existing EU staff about the EU settlement scheme. I suggest it gets a bit more regular and a bit more targeted the closer we get to the end of June. Whilst you mustn't require your staff to confirm whether or not they've successfully applied under the settlement scheme, I would encourage you to signpost information, remind staff of the deadline for applying under the scheme, and offer support and assistance wherever appropriate. Just a few points on the slide there about right to work checks. Those are kind of practical, important points there. The first point is that the right to work checks will not change until after the end of June. So what this means is that employers of EU citizens don't need to see proof of settled status. You're able to rely on an EU passport or national identity card as part of your normal right to work checks, and you can do that until the 30th of June. If you carry out your normal right to work checks that you'll be mostly familiar with, you will maintain your statutory defence against illegal working. And that's the case even in the event that the employee doesn't have the right to work. If you've done the initial right to work checks, you have maintained your statutory defence. And equally, the Home Office has said there's no need to carry out follow-up checks or retrospective checks on existing staff after the end of June. However, from July onwards, you will no longer be able to accept an EU passport alone as evidence of a permanent right to work in the UK for your new employees. So the right to work checks will change, and very likely will include a reference to seeking copy or evidence of the EU settlement scheme or another route under the immigration system. So all EU nationals arriving for the first time after January will need to meet the requirements of the new immigration points-based system, which I will look at shortly. Just want to cover off frontier workers here. Alice has always raised them, looking at it from the other way. So this it fills a gap to the EU settlement scheme, essentially. So the EU settlement scheme applies if the EU national and their family member are living in the UK before the end of the transition period. But EU nationals who work in the UK but don't live here could be eligible for what we're calling this frontier worker scheme. The scheme has been open for a while, and it enables EU citizens who work or are self-employed, but they've got to have been here before the end of December. So they work here, but they're resident abroad, and they can continue to work in this capacity going forward. The perhaps think of these as cross-border commuters. So classic one might be a non-Irish EU citizen who's living in the Republic of Ireland, but occasionally working in Northern Ireland, or a French national who travels to work for the UK to London on a regular basis. A frontier worker will be able to continue to work and travel to the UK until the end of June, just using their current passport or ID card. But after that date, from the 1st of July, they will need to have got themselves a frontier work permit, which will last for 5 years. It's free, it's a fairly straightforward application. And as Alice mentioned, in relation to frontier workers in the EU, similar kind of requirements here. The frontier worker will need some relevant documentation to demonstrate their employment, letters from the UK employer, evidence of their home base, that kind of thing. Similar to the EU settlement scheme, the EU national who began their frontier working after the 31st of December will not be eligible under the frontier worker scheme and will need to look for approval under the new points-based system, which we will come on to now. So the way that you hire from outside the UK is changing, and the new points-based system will treat EU and non-EU nationals the same. I mentioned it before, this will very often mean that employers will now need to be a sponsor license holder. And I will look at that in a couple of slides as to what that actually means for you in practice. So the points-based system, as the name suggests, anyone coming to the UK for work must meet a specific set of requirements for which they will score points. And visas are then awarded to those who gain enough points. 70 points is a magic number here. The two types of main work visa category that EU citizens and their family members are likely to apply for are the skilled worker route and the intra-company transfer visa. There are other less common visas. They include things like the sole representative, startup, global talent visas. They can be useful in the right circumstances, but I think realistically the skilled worker is going to be by far the most common work visa for many employers, and I'm going to look at that next. So anyone you want to hire from outside the UK will need to meet the requirements as I set them out on the slide. They will need a job offer from a sponsor, and a Home Office approved sponsor license holder, and that is you, the employer. The job offer needs to be at the required skill level. That is essentially A-level equivalent. Important to remember or to note that it's the job that's at the level, that skill level, rather than the person's qualifications. The skill level of the job needs to be at least kind of A-level skill. Those of you who are familiar and have already applied for work permits for other overseas nationals will be aware of the skill requirements, and you'll know that jobs have a corresponding standard occupational classification, a SOC code. Each SOC code has a designated skill. You don't need to remember all of this. There's a huge Home Office list which publishes all the different job types and tells you what qualification levels they are. So you'll need to check that the job that you want to fill is the relevant qualification. The applicant needs to speak or needs to meet the speak English language, the required standard. This can be met in a number of ways. They can be a national of a majority English-speaking country. Again, as the Home Office sees it, for example, South Africa is not on the list of majority English-speaking countries. It might seem like it would be, but it isn't. So you would look to see whether the applicants had their degree taught in English, or if failing that, they would have to pass the English language test. So they need a job offer, it needs to be at the right skill level, they need to be able to speak English to the required standard, and then we need to look at minimum salary thresholds attached to the job. You'll see on the slide, I've set out that the salary must be the minimum general threshold of 25,600 or the recognised going rate for the job in question, if that is higher. So it's the higher of the 25,600 or the requirement for the occupation known as a going rate. The going rate is obviously going to vary depending on the occupation. The more senior or specialist occupations could well have a going rate far higher than the 25,600 threshold. And equally, where the going rate is below that threshold, the applicant's going to have to be paid that minimum 25,600. Again, lots of information on the Home Office website about the going rate for specific occupations. It's a question of trawling through that as and when you need to think about filling your vacancy. Within the salary threshold, there is a little bit of flexibility by using what we call tradable points, which we'll look at the next slide. And I think just the last point to make in relation to the skilled worker route is that if you successfully apply for a skilled worker visa, it's normally going to be issued for 5 years. And the time that that applicant or that EU nationals in the UK under that visa will count towards any permanent settlement application that they might want to make later. Apologies for a rather busy slide here. I've tried to squeeze in as much information as possible. Again, all this information is contained in a lot of the Home Office guidance, but this is quite a good way of showing you how you tot up your how an applicant reaches the 70 points to be eligible for the skilled worker visa. So the first line is the job from the approved sponsor, that's you, the employer, 20 points. The next line, the job needs to be at the required skill level, so that's A level or equivalent, again, another 20 points. And the third line, that the applicant speaks English, the required standard, that's a 10 points. So collectively, those first 3 lines give the applicant 50 points. Those are the mandatory criteria and they earn them 50 points, but then the individual's got to find another 20 points from what they call these tradable points. And that can be through a combination of the salary, the job, it might be in shortage, on a shortage occupation list, or it may be the individual got a PhD. There is a little bit of flexibility around these tradable points within the salary range. And I think the best way to do it is just to have a quick look at the table in detail. So the applicant can get 20 points for a salary of 25,600 or above, or at least the going rate for the profession. So that would give them a total of 70 points. If the applicant has paid less than the general threshold or the going rate, they could still get 20 points if they are, as long as they're paid at least the 20,480. You can see that they can get 20 additional points if they have a PhD in a STEM subject relevant to the job. Equally, if the job is deemed to be in short supply as designated by the MAC, that's the Migration Advisory Committee, then the applicant would also get another 20 points. So in those circumstances, the applicant doesn't need that 25,600 salary because they can get their 20 points from either the shortage occupation job or a STEM PhD, but they still must meet the minimum salary threshold of 20,480. The applicant can also combine a PhD in a relevant job, giving them 10 tradable points with a salary, fourth line down, of 23,040, or at least 90% of the going rate. So that table hopefully gives you a flavour of how the applicant can reach the 70-point threshold required for their shortage occupation list visa. There are other rules for health and education jobs, and there's some tweaks to the rules if they're a new entrant at the start of their career, but I couldn't squeeze anything else onto the slide. But again, it's all contained in the government's guidance. Intra-company transfer is the next category. This is quite similar to the skilled worker route, but as you'll see from the slide, it's for existing employees who are being transferred by the overseas business to come and work in the UK to do a skilled role with a company that's linked by ownership to the overseas company. Again, the UK company's got to sponsor them. There's some thresholds for experience, it's normally 12 months, and the salary is a little bit higher in relation to this category. So it's 41,000 or the going rate, whichever is higher. Some of you listening will be quite familiar with the old immigration rules, and this slide is really just designed to illustrate to you what the differences are, or the differences that you might notice. The first one, obviously, is that the EU and non-EU nationals are treated the same. The second point is a really important one. There's no low-skilled visa route. So you've got to be offering a salary no lower than 20,480. The job has to be at the relevant A-level or equivalent skill level. And so whilst actually the skill level has been reduced compared to the old system, there's still no low-skilled visa route. So if you are reliant on low-skilled workers, you'll have to look at the local labour force to fill those vacancies. Equally, if you're an employer that in the past has recruited from outside of the EU, you should find the system is quicker. It potentially should take about a month rather than 3 months that it used to take under the old system. And this is largely because this resident labour market test has been removed. In the old rules, you used to have to advertise a vacancy for about 28 days, but that's now been removed so that you can see you've automatically removed 4 weeks from the process of applying. That's pretty good news, I think. You still obviously need to fill a genuine vacancy, which meets the skill and the salary thresholds. You can't just create a role that's just to facilitate the immigration of a particular specific person from overseas. There's a bit more flexibility in the system to switch categories, and so that's switching is where a worker can switch from one immigration route to another without having to leave the UK. And the last point on the slide is about no more caps. The old system had limits on the number of migrants who could come to the UK in that route per month or per year, and that capping the volume of people that could come through a particular immigration route could often cause some uncertainty and certainly slow the process down. So that's been removed, which will improve the functionality of the process as well. So I think the one thing that's become clear from this session is that more and more of you will need to get a sponsor license to become sponsor license holders in order to recruit in the skilled worker or ICT route. It says on the slide, it's quite obvious, I suppose, self-explanatory, that sponsorship plays two main roles. It provides evidence that the worker will fill a genuine vacancy in a skilled job and will be paid at the appropriate rate. But it also involves a pledge from you, the sponsor, that you will accept the duties of sponsorship and that you will meet your compliance obligations. If you already hold a sponsor license, you'll find you don't need to reapply, and they'll just give you grant you a new one to comply with the new rules. But if you're not already a licensed sponsor, you probably want to think about which migrants you might want to sponsor and think about what steps you can take now to get that all in order. The process can take up to 4 to 8 weeks to apply, and I would recommend that you start thinking about, the individuals you may want to bring through under the skilled worker route, for example. So just looking at compliance obligations, if you become a licensed sponsor, there's basically ongoing obligations, compliance obligations for certain members of your staff. You need to assign key roles and responsibilities to an authorising officer. That's somebody who's the most senior person in the organisation in charge of recruitment. You need to appoint a key contact. And that person is going to be the main point of contact with you in the Home Office, and a level 1 user is the day-to-day administrator of your sponsor licence. I think the last point to mention really is that whilst you have some key personnel responsible for managing your sponsor licence, I think compliance really extends throughout the whole organisation. And the reason I say that is that perhaps line managers who are responsible for granting promotions or increasing salaries or making changes to the roles, those are all changes that you need to notify the Home Office of. As part of your duties as a sponsor licence, you have reporting obligations to the Home Office. So some line managers may be making changes to the role, which are reportable changes, and so they need to know to communicate that to HR or to the key contacts within your organisation who are running the sponsor licence process at your end. So managers will need to be aware of this reporting requirement, which is why the last point on the slide is that really compliance does extend throughout the whole organisation. We've reached the end just in time. There are a few points on the slide there for where you can find your further information from the Home Office. Largely, there's an awful lot of information on the Home Office website, and if you look on the Make UK website, there's a couple more webinars on immigration matters coming up in the next few weeks, so feel free to join those as well. I'm not sure how we're doing for time, Hilary, but I'm happy to take some questions.
Yep, we're doing okay for time here. Okay, so any employer apply for a sponsorship license, and how much is it?
Yes, broadly speaking, any employer can apply for a sponsorship license as long as they're a genuine business and haven't fallen foul of the immigration authorities in the past. How much is it? Slightly depends on the kind of license you're applying for and the size of your organisation. I'm filling for time here while the number pops into my head. I think it's just shy of £1,500 for a sponsor license for a medium to large organisation. I think it's 1,400 and 70 something, don't quote me, but Home Office guidance will spell that out, but it's around that price. But don't forget there's more costs associated than just the sponsor license, because bringing somebody in under the skilled worker route will involve an application fee, and the certificate of sponsorship has a fee. You might need to pay the immigration surcharge. The individual might have to pay the health surcharge, which the employer may be responsible for, and the applicant may be bringing family members in. So if the employer is footing the bill for all of those costs, it could add up to several £1000s. So it's not just a sponsor license that you have to take into account when looking to bring overseas nationals into the UK. It can be quite expensive.
Thanks, Lucy. Aaron, next question.
For new recruits, should I be asking when an EU national arrived in the UK?
Yes, that's a tricky one. If we're looking about the period from January to the end of June, that's called the grace period. So a new recruit in that period, I can see why you've asked the question. No, technically you don't need to ask the individual when they arrived in the UK. Your right to work checks are simply in this grace period to check the EU passport of the person that you're seeking to recruit. And if you do the correct checks, then you will establish a defence to illegal working. So you don't need to know, and you don't need to ask when the individual arrived in the UK. The problem, obviously, is that you may know that the individual arrived after the end of the transition period. You may know that, therefore, that they don't have the right to work in the UK. They may have another immigration route to work on, but a new EU national arriving for the first time in the UK will not be eligible under the settlement scheme. So if you don't know when they arrived, you don't know actually whether they have the right to work, which is causing a bit of a concern for some employers. The Home Office have said that there's no need to do retrospective checks and there's no need to do follow-up checks. So you have established your statutory defence if you carry out the right to work checks in the normal way, even actually if you know that that individual does not have the right to work in the UK. The Home Office has said they're going to be producing a leaflet of some sort, which will be aimed at new recruits in this grace period. And the idea is that it's a leaflet or a pamphlet that employers can give to these new recruits, setting out the situation that they're in. As I understand, that's going to be ready next week. So that might be quite useful for employers who are recruiting in this grace period, where there's this kind of strange, unintentional employing of illegal workers potentially. But as I said, because there's no retrospective checks, you should have established your statutory defence, even if you have actual or you suspect the individual didn't arrive before the end of the transition, so can't apply for settled status. That a rambling question, but I think that probably answers it.
Thank you, Lucy. Okay,
next question. Should I, as a company, be asking EU national employees to confirm when they receive their settled status?
A little similar to the previous question. No, you shouldn't really be asking, have you applied for settled status? Can I have a copy of the confirmation? Because you're not technically required to have that information to satisfy your right to work checks. So the Home Office guidance is quite clear. It says don't ask employees to prove settled status, at least in this during this grace period that I'm talking about between now and June. If the worker volunteers it, I think that's quite useful information to have. So I would probably say if they're happy to share it, then that would be good, but don't make it mandatory or compulsory in any way. I think it's really important that you tell your staff about the scheme, encourage them to apply, keep up that communication, but don't ask them for confirmation when they've done it.
Thanks.
Probably the last question actually now, given time constraints. Do frontier workers have to return to their home EU country regularly?
I think our rules differ to the EU rules here. I think our rules are quite flexible. I don't think the frontier worker rules that we have are particularly prescriptive about the workers' pattern of work. I think the maximum is that we can't be in the UK for more than 180 days in the last 12 months. But equally, there's no requirement for them to go back every week. So it's not that much they have to return to their home country. Equally, they don't need to, there's not a minimum amount of time they have to be here in order to be eligible to be a frontier worker. I think Alice made this point. It's about the work that they're doing. It's got to be genuine and effective rather than marginal and ancillary. That's the language that's used. So they don't have, yes, they have to return to their home country periodically, but it's not that often.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we'll probably wrap it up there. Just thank you everybody for joining today's roadshow, and we hope you found it helpful. We'll be sending you today's slides in the follow-up pack, as I said, and the recording will be available on the Make UK website probably from tomorrow morning. We're going to chunk it up into the individual sections so it's nice and simple for you to look at and to access. If we didn't get to your question, please send it to our Brexit email, which is brexit@makeuk.org, and one of our policy team or our consultants will work out the best way of helping you. My colleague Aaron will now just post the link to our next webinar in the chat box. It's on the 4th of February from 12 noon again till 1:30, and it will deal with rules of origin. We have high-level speakers from both the business department and from HMRC, and our very own expert Keith Robe, who will talk to you about the practical ways of trying to mitigate these issues and to get around the problem. So please do take the opportunity to sign up now, and the details for this also will be in your pack. I think I'm going to give you back a few minutes of your day, and again, thank you very much for joining.